Hi, I'm Amanda, and you're listening to the Think Inclusive podcast.
Recording from my office in beautiful Marietta, Georgia. You are listening to the Think Inclusive podcast, episode 22. Today we have Amanda Morin from the National Center for Learning Disabilities and the amazing online resource understood.org. We talk about the transition back to school for students with disabilities. We also discuss strategies parents can use during IEP meetings when it is recommended for their child to move to a more restrictive setting. After the podcast, please visit patreon.com/thinkinclusivepodcast, where you can support our goal to bring you in-depth interviews with inclusive education and community advocacy thought leaders. Also, you can help other people find us by giving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the Think Inclusive podcast. So without further ado, here is the interview. Hello, everyone. Thank you for listening to the Think Inclusive podcast. Today we have Amanda Morin from the National Center on Learning Disabilities and understood.org. She is a parent and former teacher / early intervention specialist turned education writer and advocate. She currently serves as an expert and the content development manager for the National Center for Learning Disabilities, primarily on the understood.org program, but also on a new educator initiative as well. She is the author of 3 books: The Everything Parents Guide to Special Education, the Everything Kids Learning Activities book, and On the Go Fun for Kids, more than 250 activities to keep little ones busy and happy anytime, anywhere. Thank you for being on the podcast, Amanda.
Thanks for having me. That's a big promise, isn't it? Anytime, anywhere, keep them happy. That's a big promise.
That is. I'm sure the content delivers, though.
Well, thank you. I hope it delivers.
Well, this is great. We were just talking before, we started recording that you and I have never actually talked before, but I've been familiar with, all of your tweets and content for a long time now. I can't even remember how long.
I know. Same here. The same. I feel like we've traveled in the same circles for forever, and this is so exciting to actually. I just realized I didn't know what your voice sounded like, but I felt like I know you already. Isn't that such a strange feeling?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Likewise. Yeah. So I guess, what, if anything, are you working on right now that you can? I know that you've written books. I know that you're working on, Understood. Is there anything that you're working on right now?
Sure. So you mentioned a little bit briefly that I work for the National Center for Learning Disabilities, and understood.org is one of our programs, and it's designed specifically for parents of kids with learning attention issues, which encompasses learning disabilities, ADHD, and things, struggling learner kind of things. But I'm working primarily splitting my time now between that and a new educator initiative, which I'm super excited about, because what we're looking at is providing resources and information and support for general educators in the classroom who are working with kids with disabilities, because we know that kids are in their classroom, like hopefully all the time, hopefully close to 75% of the time. Hopefully they're, fully included. And so we want to make sure that teachers are having practical and actionable tools to make that work really well. And so that's a project that is going to have a beta launch in January, and by next June should be sort of fully expanded. And it's been a year and a half of research and just exciting stuff. I'm excited about it.
That's fantastic. Is there kind of any plan on rolling out on how you're going to let teachers know about this resource?
Definitely. Well, certainly one of the things that we've been doing is, you said you're familiar with tweets and those kinds of things. We're going to be, I think, leveraging the social media presence of Understood and the National Center for Learning Disabilities to let teachers know. But we're also working with multiple organizations and people like you in this field to make sure that you're able to share it with the people who really need the resources. And the neat thing is we're looking at free, right? And that's such a huge thing for teachers. I mean, having been a former teacher, I'm a recovering teacher. I don't know what you would call that. Free is huge, right? Because you're spending a lot of your own money and emotional investment in getting the right things for the kids in your classroom, because they're your kids, no matter whose kids they are, they're your kids. So I'm excited about this. We're certainly going to let people know as soon as we have beta launched in January, and we'll make sure that those resources are tweeted out, shared out, email newsletter out, all those kinds of things. So it's an exciting project to be doing. To work on both sides and see how parents and teachers can work together is really exciting to me.
Great. Now, I heard in what you said that you're a recovering teacher, which I think is an interesting phrase. How long were you a classroom teacher? Were you a classroom teacher?
I was a classroom teacher, and then I worked primarily, so I transitioned from being a classroom teacher to being a sort of working with parents and kids together in the early intervention space.
Okay.
I was a classroom teacher for 10 years. I have to think about that. Okay. 10 years. And then I did sort of, I would say it's private, but it's not. It's just different setting. It was because I worked for the Department of Education in the state that I live in. And it was private settings because you would go into kids' homes, because when you work with kids who are younger, you're in their environment because that's where they need to be learning.
Okay.
And that was lots of fun. That was a lot of fun. I miss it.
Yeah. Well, now you get to support, education in a different way, so that's good. Yeah. Would you say that as far as being an educator, that you felt frustrated? Because that's what I'm kind of picking up, that the recovering part, or is that am I not reading that correctly?
Oh, I think that there's always frustrations in being a teacher. I think for me, I wanted to do more time working with the kids. I wanted to be able to do more teaching and less paperwork and that kind of thing. But I think the recovering part is that I miss the classroom. So I call myself recovering because I feel like I'm always teaching. I write books for parents about education. I write about education. So I'm teaching in a different realm. My kids would probably tell you I teach too much at home too, but that's the recovering part. I think is that I still feel connected to the classroom in a way that I think I will never stop feeling connected.
Oh, okay. I like that. You put a little bit more a positive spin on that. That's good.
Yeah.
Well, depending on when you are listening to this, it's back to school time, and so we have a lot of kids transitioning back into school. For instance, in my district, we're already back in school. So,
wow.
Yes, I know. So we had it's a 2-month summer, but we do get the breaks in between throughout the year, which I personally like. But what advice can you give to parents on preparing their children, really, with or without disabilities, but on going back to school and just preparing them for that transition?
That's such a big question, isn't it? I'm thinking that through, and it's such a big question. I think there are a lot of things. One of the most important ones to me is to not downplay their anxieties. And I know that might sound counterintuitive in some ways, but I think when we really take the time to listen to what kids are worried about, we can help them figure out ways to work around it. So I think listening to kids' anxieties can help parents sort of reset where their own anxieties are. I try really hard in my house not to lead my kids and say, are you worried about meeting a new teacher? Are you worried? Because those are my worries, right? So I'm trying hard to listen to them. But I also think it's important to sort of acknowledge your own anxieties. And especially when you have a child who's going into back to school and may have an IEP or a 504 plan. For me, I have, and you know this, that I have 3 kids, 2 of whom have IEPs. So we do this year after year after year. And I always get nervous that there's going to be a time where I'm going to have to make sure that somebody's read their IEP or knows their accommodations. And I don't want to come across as confrontational or difficult or any of those kind of ways. So I have to find a way to sort of bridge that connection with the teacher in a way that says, let me help you because this is going to be beneficial to everybody if everybody understands the needs of my child, so we can get everybody off to a good start. And I always try to find a way to do that that's not pushy, and I'm not sure I always succeed, but I try really hard. So I think for some parents, it's a matter of just sending a quick email saying, hey, do you have questions about the IEP? Any questions I can answer about my child? Anything you need to know from me? before we start school. And then sometimes I would recommend to parents that they can have their kids sit down with their kids and write an introduction letter to their teachers, and not necessarily, they don't even have to send it. It's just an introduction letter so kids can have that sense of how they can talk about themselves to their teachers as well, and that parents sort of sort through what's important for the very beginning of the year. That's a very long answer, but it encompasses some of the things that I think about.
No, I like that. I like that. I like when I was a classroom teacher, I really liked having parents who, and there's also that kind of tone and attitude of just being open with the teacher, right, and saying, "Hey, I want you to know about my child, because they are my world, and I want you to
Right.
I want you to know who they are." And you can certainly do that without coming across too aggressive. And I like the intro letter idea. I think that's really, really great.
And I think the important thing is to presume good intention from the very beginning. And I think that it's hard when you have spent a lot of time making sure your child has the supports they need to understand that other people have good intentions towards your child as well. And I don't think that's necessarily that you're jaded or you feel like that they don't have good intentions. I think it's sometimes hard to realize that we're all working towards the same thing, which is to make a child successful and to help them be, successful and thrive. And so for me, I always have to reset and say, okay, I'm presuming good intention. This question that I may have heard may have come from somewhere that I'm not understanding. And I need to think about the position the teacher's in, or I need to think about the position the other parent is in, and sort of regroup and figure out how can I respond to that in a way that shows that I understand they're trying hard and that they want the same thing that I do.
I like that. I like that idea of presuming good intentions, and it's kind of like, well, I'm going to try to connect it to this idea of presuming competence, because it's something that we, I guess, in the inclusive education world, or however you want to say that, a community, is something that we talk about a lot. Is we are going to presume the competence of our students and not automatically jump to the conclusion, well, they can't do this, they can't do that, they can't learn. So I think that it's important to come to a new school year with that same sort of attitude.
And they do connect for me. I think of them sort of in the same way. It's sort of like keeping everybody accountable to high expectations. So if you're presuming competence, you're presuming that the child in your classroom can meet these high expectations. And if you're presuming good intent, you're assuming that everybody around them can meet your high expectations of we're doing well. We're doing this for a good cause.
Right. And to further connect these, because the more that I think about it, I really like the way that this meshes.
Yeah.
When you have a student who already thinks that the teacher doesn't like them, doesn't think that they can learn, and is already on bad footing to start the year, that student is not going to do well.
Right.
Their behavior's going to, the challenging behavior is going to crop up. There's going to be barriers to learning. I think it's really important. And something that I tell the teachers that I work with is, especially at the very beginning of the year, is get to know your students. That seems pretty obvious, right? But I think that a lot of educators just they know that there's a lot to cover. They want to get into standards right away, and so my advice to them is, look, you really have to know who your kids are, so that you can get to the standards. You really have to know what their loves are, what they're passionate about, the things, and follow their lead for the beginning, just so that you can develop that rapport. Because then, if you invest all of that time, by the time you're 2 or 3 weeks in, they're going to trust you.
Well, that connection is huge, isn't it? I mean, one of my sons is the kid that you definitely have to connect with before you've gained his trust. And, that's just the kid he is. And so I think the teachers that he has had not as easy in a time with over the years are the teachers who have not taken the time to sort of see who he is or to ask him who he is. He has a very ridiculous sense of humor. He's a punner. So like we do pun fests in our house, which is ridiculous and fun. But if you know that about him and you go in and you attack him with his sense of humor, then he is putty in your hands for the rest of the year. He's your best student. And, but if you don't do that, if you don't get to know him well, he's going to be a challenge. And I don't mean challenge in a way where it's like he needs to be out of your classroom. I just mean it's going to be challenging. So it's a huge thing. And when I taught, I always made sure that I tried to have my first contact with parents be a positive one. Like I never wanted the first contact to be a call home that says, so we've had a problem. I always wanted it to be, I'm going to introduce myself. My name's Mrs. Morin. I'm going to be your child's teacher this year. Is there anything you want to tell me? Anything you want to ask me? Just so we had that started. So it wasn't like the first time you hear something, it's panic, because it causes panic when you get a call and you don't know what's happening.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Something else I wanted to talk about and discuss with you is we have some families who are going back to transitioning back to school, and their students are included for a portion or the majority of the day in like a co-taught setting. But then they also get pulled into a small group room or a special day class, or however you want to say it. I know there's different ways to say it around the country. Some parents may be concerned about, as they get older, the school district or the school will say, this content's getting too hard. We're just not able to, your child is not going to do as well as we go forward into 4th, 5th, 6th grade. We really need to look at a more restrictive environment. I know that is on the minds of parents as they go back to school. Do you have any advice to parents as they prepare for those conversations and prepare for that new school year?
Yeah, those are scary conversations, and I think they're in the back of the head of so many parents. It's in the back of my head, even as a parent, a lot of the time. And one of the things that I always want to tell parents is to really stick with asking about what's happening now and what's the data that shows that this isn't going to work or hasn't been working. That's kind of convoluted, but honestly, if it's working, if the supports that are in place that are working, if your child is succeeding and doing well and meeting goals in the setting that they're already in, predicting the future from that is not really possible. There has to be some evidence showing that this child needs to be moved to a more restrictive environment. And so I think it's really important for parents to know that they absolutely can ask that question. What data do you have that shows that this isn't working? And I think the next question is, and what can we change in the present setting to try and make it work before we move to a more inclusive setting? A less inclusive setting, a more restrictive setting. And I think that to that point, one of the things that's really important for parents to understand is the idea of least restrictive environment. And I think that, you and I know that, a lot of teachers know that, but least restrictive environment is in the law. The Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, IDEA law. That's hard to say.
I know.
that a child should be educated, a student should be educated in the least restricted environment possible, which means they should be in a general education setting with their same age peers as much as possible with the support they need. So anywhere outside of that is a more restrictive environment. So the law sort of supports that. If there are supports that can be put into place and your child can still succeed in that setting, that's the first thing to go to. And so I think a lot of parents are nervous speaking up and saying that they know that. I think it feels confrontational to say, well, I know that the law says my child deserves to be in a least restrictive environment. but it's really not. It's being informed, it's being assertive, it's showing that you're understanding and willing to work with the team to figure out what other supports might be helpful to keep your child in the environment they're in.
Yeah, I love those suggestions. I think you're right on when you're talking about data, because data is emotionless, right?
Right.
It is doesn't have any baggage. So when
Right.
when you say this is how my child was doing last year, and why would we make that change to a more restrictive environment when they haven't shown that they're not able to perform or excel at the same rate that they
Right.
were the year before,
Right.
and to that point, let's say they aren't, performing
Mhm.
or excelling or achieving at the same rate, then, well, why is that? Because they
Mhm.
were last year. So I think you're right that the data question and asking why.
And I think too, at the beginning of the year, it's really important to keep in mind it's the beginning of the year, right? You're
Mm-hmm.
just starting out. And I know you know what I'm talking about here.
I do.
So like when it comes to data, the first 3 weeks of the school year really are not as accurate as the next 6 weeks, if you will, because what you're looking at is that getting used to. And for some kids, it's actually a honeymoon period where you don't see some of the things that you might see later on. But for other kids, it might be an adjustment. So I think it's important to also not only look at data, but look at how much data, right? So it's not just like, well, in these 2 weeks, this has been really difficult, but across time, here are the things that we're seeing consistently is really important.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
That's great advice. So I guess you can put on your educator hat on, your recovering educator hat on. And we get, as far as the website and people asking us questions, we get a lot of questions from educators who are in districts that maybe the idea or the philosophy of inclusive education just isn't as big of a priority as
Right.
it is for others. And so we get a lot of questions about, how can I turn things around in my district? Who do I talk to? What do I do to promote inclusive practices? Is there any strategies or ideas that you could give educators as they're listening to this conversation?
Well, firstly, I would just like to applaud educators for asking that question. I mean, it's a great question to ask, and it shows that you're really, really involved and ready to do it. And I think there are a couple of things. I think the first thing is make your own classroom as inclusive as you can, right? So you're changing your classroom to meet your expectations and philosophies. And I also think that you need to acknowledge the systems in which you work sometimes, and it can be frustrating. But I think making sure that you have a good relationship with the special education teachers and the paraprofessionals who are there to support and asking about co-teaching strategies as opposed to necessarily like pulling kids out. How can we do this in the classroom? I think is always a great question to ask, and to bring it up at an IEP meeting as well. I think not just when, I think just in front of everybody, it's a good question to ask. Are there ways that we can do this in the classroom? What can I do to support that? Who's there who can support me in doing that? And I also think bringing parents into the conversation can be really helpful, because if you have parents who believe in inclusion and they really want it to happen, they can start sort of a drive from the outside, if you will. I don't even know how to say that, but that ability for parents to come in and speak to administration, whether it's superintendents or school boards, and say, this is really important to us. It supports you as a teacher. So I'm not saying like have an uprising, because it's not what I'm suggesting at all. But
Right.
I'm definitely saying make sure if you have parents who believe in this, that they can bring in all the information that they have. It's funny, you and I both know Nicole Eridix, who wrote the book Inclusion in Action.
Yes.
I think it's a fantastic book for teachers to read. I think it's a fantastic book for teachers to read and then give to their students' parents to read as well. It's actually, we're doing a book club through understood.org, and it's one of the books. It's the next book we're reading, and having users talk to Nicole and that kind of a thing, because I think it just gives you practical strategies it's literally called Practical Strategies, Inclusion in Action, to really start adopting these practices in your classroom. And I think finding at least one more teacher who has the same belief can make you feel less alone in that. And whether it's through a site like Think Inclusive or this podcast or a community on the ground, it may not matter where that support comes from at first, but I think it's important to know that there are other people who are trying this too and maybe hitting the same obstacles.
Yes, that's exactly what turned me around, because in my teaching credential program, it was very inclusive. The strategies and the assumption was that you're going to go and you're going to get a job and you're going to be supporting students in settings with typically developing kids. And when I got my first job, it wasn't that. I worked in a self-contained special education classroom, and knowing all the information I had, I was at a complete loss. Well, how do I make what I know is best practice? How do I make it work for my kids? And that was really the impetus of why I started the website, because I just didn't know. I didn't know what I didn't know. So.
And if you don't know what you don't know, you find people who know what you need to know.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And it was so encouraging to find other people who thought like I did, because then I realized, oh, I'm not alone, and and we can all work on this bigger idea together. And so I also want to encourage other self-contained classroom teachers, because I don't think you know this, Amanda, but I taught 13 years in the classroom, all of which were in self-contained settings.
Oh, I did not know that. Wow. Okay.
Yes. So, and I remember having conversations with certain people in our community, and they said, well, why are you still there? And I said, well, I have mixed feelings, but I feel like for whatever reason, I'm here, and I'm going to, like what you said, make my setting as inclusive as possible, and work what I felt was best for my students at my particular school, and all the while trying to learn more and more strategies on how to affect the larger system. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do, and I think that's important to know, right? That it's not an all or nothing proposition, right? It's not we're all inclusive or we're not inclusive. It's you can affect your piece of the world, and that makes a big impact. It's like a ripple effect, right? And I know that sounds very Pollyanna, but it's really true. It's always amazing to me to see. I mean, like communities like ours, the ones that this inclusive community where just knowing each other, even if it's online, we all sort of pick up the thread and make the difference, and are teaching parents and other teachers, and that little difference can really grow to a big movement. And just because you can't see that the movement is coming doesn't mean you're not building towards it.
Right. Well, I certainly hope that what we're doing is making a difference. So
I just have to believe that.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's my job to believe that.
I just want to make sure everyone knows where they can find you, as far as following your tweets, and I don't know if you're on Facebook as the author.
I am.
Okay.
I am. So
give us your details.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm really easy. I'm at Amanda Morin, and Morin is Morin on Twitter. So I'm just at Amanda Morin. And on Facebook, I'm Amanda Morin, author and consultant, which is a big fancy way of saying this is my professional page. So I think it's facebook.com/Amanda Morin Teaches if you're looking for it. And I have all sorts of other social media that I'm really lax in using, so I probably shouldn't promote it here.
That's fine.
Yeah.
That's fine.
I'm pretty active on Twitter, and also you can find me. Like I do a lot of writing and blogging at understood.org. So I'm always sort of writing about my experiences and putting new things out there. And that's easy to find too.
Yes, and for those of you who don't know or aren't familiar with understood.org, it's fantastic. The resources that are on there, including video, which I know it can be sometimes more engaging for some people, and I know that it's just a really excellent, really warehouse of resources.
It built-in accessibility tools too, which I always feel like is important to mention, because it has like a built-in read assist so it's there. If you're accessing information differently, we're built for you. The understood.org site is. And I'm very proud of that. I will tell you that that's something that I think is important too. So.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank Amanda Morin for being on the Think Inclusive podcast. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me on.
That is our show. We would like to thank Amanda Morin for being a guest on the Think Inclusive podcast. Make sure to follow her on Twitter and Facebook and look for her work on understood.org. Follow Think Inclusive on the web at thinkinclusive.us, as well as Twitter, Facebook, Google+, and Instagram. Today's show was produced by myself using an SM58, USB Logitech headset, Zoom H1 handy recorder, MacBook Pro, GarageBand, and a Skype account. You can also subscribe to the Think Inclusive podcast via Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, or Anchor.fm, the easiest way to start a podcast. From Marietta, Georgia, please join us again on the Think Inclusive podcast. Thanks for your time and attention.